So as we all know, next week is Yom HaAtzmout, is Israel Independence Day. And we know the Hebrew date is usually HaEyar, the 5th of Iyar. However, I saw on some calendars that they're celebrating this year on the 6th of Iyar. Whether it's because they couldn't do Yom HaZikaron the night after Shabbos, I'm not 100% sure myself. I just noticed that someone else mentioned it to me. But anyway, we'll work with HaEyar anyway. Because I saw it. So there's always a question on Yom HaAtzmout, the question of reciting Hallel. Is one obligated, permitted, prohibited to say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmout? So in order to understand whether we say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmout, we have to go back and learn more about the obligation of Hallel, when are the appropriate or inappropriate times to say it, and then we'll try to plug it into Yom HaAtzmout. So the Gemara tells us in Erechin, among other Gemaras as well, about the different days of year we say Hallel. The Gemara tells us 18 days a year we're gomrim as Hallel. 18 in Eretz Yisrael, 21 in Chutz La'aretz. What are the 18 days a year we complete the Hallel? Very good. The 8 days of Sukkot, 8 days of Hanukkah, 1 day of Pesach, and 1 day of Shavuos. And for Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel, we add 3, 1 more for Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos. So that's the 18 days a year with Gomer as a Hallel, and 21 in Chutz La'aretz. So the first obvious question is, well, we just finished Pesach, so why is it when it comes to Pesach, we only said a full Hallel the first day, and in Chutz La'aretz the first 2 days? Yet by the Yontiv of Sukkot, we say Hallel every day. So what's the difference between Chol Hamoed Pesach and Chol Hamoed Sukkot? Even more than Chol Hamoed, even the last days of Pesach, Shvi Shel Pesach, we don't say Hallel either. Again, when I say we don't say Hallel, Hallel for our purposes is a full Hallel. So I'm not recognizing half Hallel at the moment. And that's why we didn't mention Rosh Chodesh as any of the days of reciting Hallel. Because we do say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, but it's a Chatzi Hallel, and that's only a minhag. Today that's the halacha, that's our minhag, but it's based on a minhag, because the Gemara talks about, I think it was one of the rabbis, it might have been Rav, when he went to Bavel, he noticed that first he was confused, he never saw, he went and they were saying Hallel on this day. And then whatever, but they did only a half a Hallel, so he realized it must have been a minhag. So the Chatzi Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is definitely a minhag, and there's a machlokas among the Sfardim and Ashkenaz on whether you make a bracha. Our minhag is minhag Ashkenaz, we make a bracha on Chatzi Hallel. Among Sfardim, there are always different minhagim, but I guess the classical minhag Sfard is no bracha, because you don't make a bracha on a minhag. So that's a whole discussion. That itself is not for tonight, but that's a whole question in general. Do you make a bracha on a minhag? And the answer is, of course, it depends. On some things, even Ashkenaz agrees to, when you do on Hoshana Rabbah, you hit the Aravas, no bracha. And that's a minhag. Even Ashkenaz don't make a bracha. So there's certain minhagim that we don't make a bracha on. Yontiv Sheni, everyone makes a bracha on. Again, assuming Yontiv Sheni is a minhag, which is one of the reasons in the Gemara. And the issue is versus Chatzi Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. And in fact, that's actually another machlokus Rishonim. The Chatzi Hallel we say on Pesach. What is that? So some want to say the Chatzi Hallel we say on Pesach is also only a minhag. Some say no, that's a takana d'Rabbanan. So either way, that's a separate share on whether we make a bracha on a minhag. Getting back to Hallel, so what is the distinction then between Pesach, where we say Hallel only once or twice, and Sukkot, we say Hallel every day? So the Gemara answers, I'll tell you the difference. The difference is, on Sukkot, each day you bring an independent korban. Each day you're obligated in a different sacrifice, and therefore it's kamoed b'fnei atzmo. It's like its own independent holiday. However, by Pesach it says ka'eleh, these. We bring the same korban every day. It doesn't have its own independent korban. Hence, it's not like a moed b'fnei atzmo, and hence doesn't warrant a complete Hallel. So that's what the Gemara says. The difference is, on Sukkot you bring a new korban every day. On Pesach Yom, apparently having your own korban is one of the prerequisites for reciting a Hallel. The question is, what else do you need besides being able to having an obligation for independent korban? So the Gemara goes on and gives us more of the rules. It's working?
Yeah.
So the Gemara says, what about Shabbos? Why don't we say Hallel every Shabbos? Shabbos is a happy occasion. We're usually in a joyous mood on Shabbos. Why doesn't Shabbos warrant its own Hallel? So Gemara answers, you know why? For a technical reason. It's not called a moed, which is itself a discussion. It seems to be a question whether it's called a moed or not, but working with this Gemara, we'll accept it as it's not a moed. And therefore, since it's not called a moed, it's only, we have Oneg Shabbos, we don't have Simcha, and therefore, no Hallel. So the Gemara says, so what about Rosh Chodesh? Rosh Chodesh Ikroi Moed. Rosh Chodesh is classified as a moed, it's called a moed. So why don't we say Hallel, again a full Hallel on Rosh Chodesh? Because the Gemara says, because it's not Ikdish Ba'asiyas Malacha. It's not a day which has an Isser Malacha. It's not a day where there's a prohibition of, like on a Shabbos or a Yontif. It's a day Rosh Chodesh we can do everything. We drive, we cook, etc. We do it all. So therefore, there are no prohibitions on this day, though Isser Malacha. So therefore, you cannot say a full Hallel. So the Gemara gave us 3 conditions. I will call them the big 3. What are the 3 requirements, the 3 conditions you need to recite Hallel? So number 1, it has to be called a moed. Number 2, it has to be Ikdish Ba'asiyas Malacha. It has to be a day with Isser Malacha. You asked me, what about Chol Hamoed Sukkot? So the answer is, that's a separate problem, how we treat Chol Hamoed. We focus too much on the Chol part, not the Moed. Because the answer is, Chol Hamoed is Ikdish Ba'asiyas Malacha, and there are heterim for going to work and doing things, but specific heterim. So really, Chol Hamoed is not the way most people view it, but it actually is Ikdish Ba'asiyas Malacha. So you need, it has to be called a Moed, it has to have an Isser Malacha. And thirdly, it has to have its own independent korban. That's what knocked out the rest of Pesach. The Gemara asks, what about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur? They seem to have the big 3. So why don't we say a full Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? We don't say any Hallel. So why don't we say a full Hallel? So the Gemara answers, you're right. Strictly speaking, it's a day that should be. And in fact, we do assume there is a mitzvah simcha, as the Rambam writes, but it's not Yemei Simcha Yisera, it's not an open Simcha, because the Gemara says, is it appropriate to be singing Shira when your life is on the line? People are being judged. The Sifrei Chaim, the books of the living, are opened up to see if I'm going to make it the whole year. So it's not an appropriate day to be singing this Shira. So that's why we don't say Hallel. But right, but based on the principles, it would be a day you would say Hallel. So that's what the Gemara says, where you don't say Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Gemara says, but it seems to shrug up this whole thing. The Gemara says, but Chanukah we say Hallel, a full Hallel. It's certainly not called the Moed. It's a rabbinical holiday, so the Torah couldn't classify it as a Moed. There's no Issa Malacha. So what exactly are these rules for?
No korban, right?
And right. So the Gemara. So anyway, you need all three of them, even if it has one out of the three or not. You need all three. So the Gemara says. So therefore, how can we say Hallel? The Gemara says you're right. There's another reason you could say Hallel, and this could be very relevant to Yom HaAtzmout. Is Yom She'ira Bo Nes, a day where a miracle happened. Chanukah is a day where a miracle happened, hence that's why you're obligated in Hallel. Are you telling me it's therefore every time on a day which a miracle happens, then you could say Hallel? The Gemara says, so what about Purim? The Yontiv of Purim, a holiday happened, a miracle happened, Yom She'ira we were saved from the decree of Haman, and yet we do not say Hallel on Purim. So what do you mean, Yom She'ira Bo Nes? The Gemara answers actually three answers. The Gemara answers, answer number one is, which also we'll see might be relevant, it'll be relevant to Purim, or it'll be relevant to Yom HaAtzmout, we'll get to. It's a geographical answer. Purim, the miracle happened in Persia. Chanukah happened in Israel. So the Gemara says we don't say Hallel on a nes that happened in Chutz La'aretz. So Purim happened in Chutz La'aretz, Chanukah didn't. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? Are you kidding me? Last I checked, the exodus from Egypt wasn't in Israel. It was in Egypt. It was in the Midbar. So what do you mean? We say Hallel on Pesach, or when we say during Sukkot, the Anei HaKavod, the 40 years we're traveling in the Midbar. So what kind of joke is that you're telling me that the miracle had happened in Israel? The Gemara answers, you're right, but it's accounting season, so we can invoke the grandfather clause, which the Gemara says is you're right. It's only once Yoshua took the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael, then Eretz Yisrael became a prerequisite to say Hallel on a miracle that happened. But obviously before the Jewish people ever entered the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael is not an issue. So therefore, for the Jews in Egypt, of course, it was appropriate to say Hallel, but during Purim time we already had Eretz Yisrael, and therefore we don't say on a nes on a Hallel afterwards. That's the first answer to the Gemara. A2 is, we do say Hallel. What kind of question is that? Why don't we say Hallel? We do say Hallel, but we don't say Hallel. So the Gemara says, Kriyasa zu Halela. Kriyas HaMegillah is the Hallel. We don't say the classical Hallel, but Megillah is all about publicizing the miracle, thanking, praising God, etc. So therefore, we don't say Hallel. But we do say Hallel, but not the Hallel, as we all know, the Hallel HaMitzri, but we do the Hallel of Kriyas HaMegillah. And in fact, so much so that the Meiri raises the question, what happens if you live in a place on Purim and you don't have a Megillah? So the Meiri says, then you say Hallel. Kriyas HaMegillah is a Hallel, but it takes the place of Hallel. But if not, we don't paskin like this in Meiri. We paskin even if you don't have a Megillah, you don't say Hallel. Why is that? It seems like a very cogent argument of the Meiri, and the answer is, as we'll see, there are different types of Hallel. Clearly, the Hallel of the Megillah Esther is different than the Hallel of Yitzias Mitzrayim, Hallel Mitzvah, which also could get to have some relevance to Yom HaAtzmout as well. So that's the Gemara's second answer. And the Gemara's third answer is Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan. You know, we don't say Hallel because we were servants of Achashverosh. True, we went free, and we survived, and we weren't killed by the decree of Haman, but we're still under the dominion of Achashverosh. And the only time we say Hallel is we're in the status of Avdei Hashem and not Avdei Paro. So therefore, the Gemara gives three answers why we don't say Hallel on Purim. The first answer is saying it's fundamentally it's not a day that warrants Hallel, since the miracle did not happen in Israel. The second and third answer is fundamentally there are days that it's Chayiv and Hallel. Well, number two is saying it is a day that's obligated in Hallel, and we do say it with the Megillah. Mm-hmm. And the third answer is saying it's not a day that warrants Hallel because it's like we're still under the dominion of Achashverosh. That's the Gemara. So we have two general. So I asked you, what is the Machaya? What is the obligation to say Hallel? So there are two possibilities. Either the big three, as we call them, it has to be a Moed, a holiday. It has to be Isser Malacha, a day which is Isser Malacha, and you have to have its own independent Karban, or a day that a miracle happened. You have two different reasons. So interesting. With this, we can answer up a famous question of the poskim. You all know, if I asked you, why don't we say Hallel the seventh day of Pesach? Why don't we say Hallel Shvi Shel Pesach? You know, last week or something. I think it was last week. Mm-hmm. Why didn't we say Hallel on the seventh day of Pesach? What will you tell me?
Isn't that Yizkor?
Actually, it's the eighth day, but in Eretz Yisrael it is. So the answer is, well, the answer the poskim bring down is the famous answer of, is it appropriate to be singing Hallel when the Egyptians are drowning in the sea? Kind of like at the Seder, we dip, during the 10 plagues, we dip some wine out. And saying that, all humans are part of God's creation. So the post can bring down the reason. It's a medrash and a Gemara in Sanhedrin that we learn out that they got rebuked for saying Hallel while the Egyptians were drowning. So, and therefore, we don't say Hallel because it's a day where it was the drowning of the Egyptians. So the question is, why did the poskim have to come up with this new answer? Because we don't need this answer. What answer do we already gave when we said what's the difference between why we say Hallel on the whole Sukkot and not on the whole Pesach? We said because Pesach doesn't have its own independent Karban. So that covers everything. It covers Chol Hamoed and the last days of Pesach. So why would the poskim feel a need to give another reason why we don't say? Why do you bring up the Egyptians drowning in the sea? I mean, it's a nice medrash, but why do I need that as a reason not to say Hallel? So with Alwa Yisod, it fits in very nicely, because we said there are two fundamental reasons why you could say Hallel. Mm-hmm. So let's go over it. So on the seventh day of Pesach, we should say Hallel. It's the big three. Or we'll see, it's only the big two, but it's a Moed. And it's Issa Malacha. No Hallel because you don't have the third one. There's no independent Karban. But something else happened on the seventh day of Pesach. a big miracle happened. It's called Kriyas Yam Suf, the splitting of the Red Sea. So we see a day which a miracle happens that warrants a Hallel. On that, the post can lead to another reason. Because the Egyptians drowned in the sea, we don't want to look like we're openly celebrating the death of the Egyptians. So it fits in very well why we need both the reasons, because it's two totally different reasons why one is obligated in Hallel, and therefore that takes care of both reasons. So, but the question is, if that's the case, if we don't say a full Hallel because the Egyptians suffered in the Red Sea, so there's another question. I left out one other time when we say a full Hallel. I only gave you the 18 times or the 21 times. There's one other time I left out that we say a full Hallel. When is that? I know Pesach. I guess if Pesach just happened a little while ago, then you'd probably remember. But since it happened a couple of months ago, so what happened? So what did we do the first night of Pesach?
I said Mari. I said Hallel.
Right. So interesting, which is another machlokas Svardim Ashkenaz. Noah's referring to the Hallel. You were to buy it?
No, Theodore, base Theodore.
Oh, so they did it in base. Okay, so they followed the
greens.
Yeah, they followed the minhag here. What I'm saying is that they point out that the Svardi minhag, and today many Ashkenaz shuls do it as well, whether to say the straight minhag Ashkenaz is no Hallel in shul Pesach night, and the Svardi minhag is to say it. However, Rav Soloveitchik held from saying it, and therefore many of the young Israels and many shuls throughout North America are Talmidi of the Rav, students of Rav Soloveitchik, and therefore they took the minhag of the Rav to say Hallel. So, but that's not what the Gemara doesn't talk about, that Hallel.
But the Haggadah Hallel?
That's what we're looking for. That's the Haggadah Hallel. The Hallel we say in the Haggadah, the night of Pesach, that's a full Hallel, albeit split up into two. We have a nice meal in between, and also the many other differences. It's the only time we're saying Hallel at night, and also importantly, there's no bracha in the Hallel at the Haggadah. Those who say Hallel in shul do make a bracha, and maybe we'll get into that distinction of the two different types of Hallel. But so we know we say Hallel Leil Pesach, because that's the night, we're going free, that's part of our Yetzias Mitzrayim. But let me ask you something. What happened the night we left? Or what happened that night?
Well, we figure out whether it fits into one of the categories, so it's a moed.
No, but what happened in Egypt that night? I'm saying...
Brought a korban?
No.
Korban Pesach? No? That was the day before?
What was the 10th plague?
Makapachoros?
Yeah, so Makas Pachoros happened that night. And then, then Paro said, let us go. So, how can we say Hallel? What's the difference? When it came to the Egyptians drowning in the sea, we say no Hallel. Yet the night of Pesach we say Hallel. We shouldn't say Hallel, Makas, Bechoros. What's the difference? We don't care about the firstborns, but the rest we do care about. What's going on? Well, we don't care about the firstborn, so the answer is, or one possible answer is, we know that there's a fundamental difference between if you're involved in the miracle yourself, or you're celebrating an anniversary, an event. So what happened is we have a mitzvah on the night of Pesach, Chayav Adam Liros it's Atzmo ki hu yatsa miMitzrayim. We have an obligation that we have to feel like we ourselves, we're not remembering an event that happened thousands of years ago. In fact, that's the hardest mitzvah of the night of Pesach. As hard as eating the matzah, marah, korach is, to feel the experiential that we're actually leaving Mitzrayim. That's the hardest mitzvah. And therefore, the Haggadah says, Lefichach, no, in front of Shira Chadasha, and we sing the Hallel. So the Hallel was singing the night of Pesach. That's a Hallel Shel Nes. Right now, we're celebrating the fact we ourselves just transformed ourselves from Avdus to Cheres. And in fact, that's why there's no bracha, because the famous Rav Haigon, the Ran quotes in Arvei Psachim, there's two types of Hallel, we say. There's what the classical, let's say the Hallel on the Yom Tovim, is a Hallel Shel Kriya, Kriyas Hallel, and what they call Hallel Shel Nes. So the Rav Haigon, right? You know why there's no bracha on Hallel El Pesach? Because that's the one we're doing spontaneously. We're just overcome with emotion and joy. Hakaras Atov, we scream out in Hallel. So it doesn't make any sense. You know what? Wait a second. God, I'm saying Hallel. Asher Kishem B'Tzav Tzivano, you commanded me. Okay, now I'm thanking you because you commanded me to thank you. The whole part is the Hallel Shel Shira, Hakaras Atov. So it's spontaneous, so therefore you just spit it out. It's a Hallel without a bracha. But the point being, it's a Hallel Shel Nes. So a nes a miracle that you yourself went through, so it's obvious why you're saying Hallel. I'm thanking God for what He did to me. If there's collateral damage, so let it be. But that's not why I'm celebrating. It's obvious to the onlooker you're celebrating your own happiness. However, if you look closely in the Gemara, the Gemara is berating the Malachim. The Jews actually sang Hallel. The Gemara tells us in Arvei Psachim. They sang Hallel when they sang the Shira. They sang Hallel when they crossed over. He was berating the angels who were sitting in the comfy box seats up there in heaven watching the scene. How dare you sit there singing, and the angels were singing Hallel. And God said, it's inappropriate for you to be singing Hallel when you're watching the Egyptians drown. They weren't in any danger. They're sitting up there. So if you yourself experienced the nes, so therefore we see, that you could say Hallel even if there's the downfall of other people. So therefore that is the difference between a Hallel Shel Nes and a Hallel Shel Kriya. So they point out that, and that's what the Netziv writes. There's a whole discussion about whether it's a whole discussion whether Hallel in general is Hallel D'Oraisa or D'Rabbanan. So there's a famous sheet of the Bahag. He counts Hallel as one of the 613 mitzvahs, and the Rambam talks about it in the Sefer Mitzvahs. But he's talking about Hallel is only D'Rabbanan. It's the words of David HaMelech from Tehillim. So what do you mean? How can it be D'Oraisa? There's a whole. So so they give the famous answer of the Ramban is, no, the concept of Hallel is D'Oraisa. Like the concept of davening is D'Oraisa, but the text could be D'Rabbanan. But perhaps based on a Netziv, we can answer more fundamentally. We could say it depends what type of, maybe there's no machlokas. When it comes to a Hallel Shel Nes, then everyone agrees it's a D'Oraisa. But a Hallel Shel Kriya, that's only D'Rabbanan. In fact, as the Lashon HaRambam is, the Rambam says Hallel is Chanukah. Hallel, he discusses the laws of Hallel and Chanukah, and he says Hallel is D'Rabbanan. But he has a Lashon of, and the Hallel of Kriyas HaHallel. So perhaps everyone agrees when it comes to Kriyas HaHallel, that's D'Rabbanan, but a Hallel B'Shas HaNes, that's a D'Oraisa. And in fact, with this, there's a fundamental machlokas Netziv, which is fundamental to the issue of saying Hallel on Yom HaAtzmout. So again, so we see Hallel B'Shas Nes is a D'Oraisa. Again, so therefore 1948, again, so this whole discussion of saying Hallel on Yom HaAtzmout is making an assumption that having the state of Israel under Jewish control is a good thing. I'm not going into the whole Satmar sheet and other sheets that don't necessarily fit. Again, they all have sources. The Satmar is a tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he has a whole kuntris on that. I'm not saying I agree with what he writes, but he definitely has the sheets to rely on. So I'm just saying, obviously, if you're going to view the creation of the state of Israel as a negative, then obviously there's no need to ask the question. And that being said, even if you don't hold like the Satmar that the state of Israel shouldn't have been even formed, whether you don't like things, whether it's based on hashkafic, other reasons, there are people who are, let's say, pro the Medina for the, I'm not getting into the discussion pros and cons. I'm just being descriptive. So again, this whole discussion is if you assume having Israel under Jewish control is a good thing, it's a Yeshua, and we look at 1948 and 67, and I'm just talking about 48 because it's Yom HaAtzmout, but all from the last 62 years as the tremendous miracles and Hakaras HaTov of the fact that we have Eretz Yisrael, what goes on in Eretz Yisrael, like anything in life, like any good marriage, 99% of it is good, but you're always going to have some issues. Of course, there are going to be some issues in Eretz Yisrael. You always can find negatives in anything. But fundamentally, you view having Eretz Yisrael, or the Torah going on, or the positives, far outweigh the negatives that are going on. So obviously, working with those two assumptions, where many in the yeshivish world do not agree with those assumptions, and hence, if you don't agree with those assumptions, it's not going to be an issue of saying Hallel, because it's not something that, do you say Slichas maybe for some, but it's not an issue that you say Hallel. So working with those assumptions, the machlokas I'm about to tell you in the Tziv and the Chasam Sofer is going to be critical to our question. So we see everyone basically agrees Hallel b'shas nes. You have a chiyuv to say Hallel. Again, not necessarily with a bracha, as Rav Hagel pointed out. We don't say Hallel with a bracha the night of Pesach even. It's a Hallel shel nes, and I think the Meiri writes as well. A Hallel shel nes would require you say Hallel, but not necessarily with a bracha. But either way, so it's a machlokas Chasam Sofer and the Tziv. What about subsequent years? But everyone agrees that year you were involved, you say a Hallel shel nes, a mitzvah min HaTorah. What about the next year, the anniversary of the date? Are you obligated to say Hallel at all? You have an obligation to Raisa. So that's a Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer writes that he thinks not only that year, but every subsequent year is a Chiyuv D'Oraisa. In fact, he gets the Chasam Sofer is talking in the context that he's talking about Purim. But when what the Gemara was saying, the Gemara made a Kal V'chomer. The Gemara said, if, really we should say Hallel on Purim, but we gave different reasons technically why we don't. So the Gemara says, if from Avdus to Cherus, if from slavery to freedom, i.e. Pesach, we recite Hallel, Kal V'chomer, from the threat of death, be Misa L'chayim, which is Purim. And therefore we should say Hallel on Purim, except we don't for technical reasons. So therefore, based on this Chasam Sofer, again, whether the Chasam Sofer would say Hallel, it's a separate question, what his view would be. But based on this principle, the Chasam Sofer, that saying Hallel, so he holds saying Hallel in a subsequent year is a D'Oraisa. That's the Chasam Sofer Shita. Again, nothing we do in general on the anniversary of the Nes. And the Tziv says no, only the year itself. That's D'Oraisa. Every other year is only a D'Rabbanan. It's a Takana D'Rabbanan to say Hallel, called Tika D'Rabbanan, Kain D'Oraisa Tika, but it's only a Din D'Rabbanan. So why is this Machlokas Chasam Sofer, the Tziv, so critical to whether you say Hallel Yom HaAtzmout? I'll tell you why. Because if you say, like the Chasam Sofer, that Hallel, again, so assuming 1940 was a miraculous event, it's a great thing, etc. So Hallel 1940 is a given. But what about 1949, 1950? So based on the Chasam Sofer, you have a Chiyuv Daraisa. So I don't need a Beis Din, I don't need Chazal, I don't need Anshe Knesset to come and tell me to say Hallel. I don't need a Navi to come down tomorrow and tell me I put on tefillin tomorrow morning. It's a Chiyuv Daraisa. If it's something that's a biblical obligation, it happens automatically. So I don't need any permission, so to speak, because I'd have a Chiyuv to say Hallel. So therefore, if you say like the Chasam Sofer, it's no problem. If you say like the Netziv, you have a problem, because the Netziv writes, it's a Takana D'Rabbanan, and we don't have the power today to make Takanas D'Rabbanan from out of nowhere. In other words, so therefore, it could be if Chazal were around today, they would have, but we don't. So therefore, that's one of the tainas, which is a valid taina. So it's only a taina if you work with the Netziv Shita. That you can't, that you could argue you don't have a right, even if it's a day that we think warrants a Hallel, but we can't just decide to make a Takana D'Rabbanan to say Hallel on that day. So it comes out, it's a Machlokas, Netziv, and the Chasam Sofer. So how do we paskin? It's hard to say on a Machlokas, Netziv, Chasam Sofer. It's hard to say there's a clear-cut psak. So what's the general Klalei HaPsak? We have a principle Safak Brachas Lahakel. So we have a principle. So you do a mitzvah without the bracha. So in other words, we're not going to have, or again, we'll see. There'll be some that might even say with the bracha. But I'm saying based on this chasam, if you're learning like this, it comes out that it'd be a bachokis chasam sofer netziv. So therefore, you would make a bracha because maybe it's like the netziv, and therefore I'm saying a bracha of atola. But if you say a hallel, so therefore, you could say a hallel according to and it's not necessarily you can't say a hallel according to netziv. But there is a discussion in the Gemara that you can't. The Gemara says anyone who says a hallel, anyone who says hallel every day is a magadef, is someone who blasphemes God. I'm not saying hallel every day, but some Rishonim learn to say hallel on a day where you're not required to is also a problem. So therefore that gets into, then to someone to say then to avoid the problem, they'll say a chatzi hallel. As we pointed out, a chatzi hallel isn't a hallel. And therefore, so you want to avoid the bracha because it's a machlokas chasam sofer netziv, and you don't want to say a full hallel because maybe the Gemara is a magadef, and also I think there's a Zohar or maybe an Ari that says during Sfiras HaOmer you shouldn't be saying, you can't say a full hallel because it's a time of mourning. So therefore, whatever your reasons want, so therefore, some want to say, so you have different minhagim. So there are those, so I said, based on this, I said, so therefore you shouldn't say a bracha. Then how far do you want to go? Whether you say a full hallel without a bracha, is that enough? Or maybe you're concerned with saying a full hallel, even if it's a takana d'Rabbanan, maybe you're not allowed to. So therefore, some have a minhag of only doing a chatzi hallel, without a bracha. The different minhagim, and this want to point out there are some shittas out this time. I'm not going to go into the detail, but there are a minority of you who say even with a bracha to say hallel. So some say, based on Tosas and Sukkah, you have to have the whole Kaisel. Some might argue, but a miracle that happens in Israel constitutes the whole Kaisel. Or further difficulty is the Meiri. The Meiri even says when a congregation is saved, he still says, as I pointed out, you wouldn't make a bracha. So therefore, and Rabbi Avadia Yosef also writes that one shouldn't recite Hallel with a bracha, a bracha as well. So that's some do compare it to Chanukah. Another one, Rav Meshulam Roth, in the Kol, he was a great Rav in Europe. He also paskin one can recite a bracha on Hallel and Yom HaAtzmout. Based on the Magen Avraham quotes from the Maharam al-Shalkar, he says it's similar to Purim, that a community can institute a holiday when a miracle happens. So therefore, and they write that you're right. The Chasam Sofer writes Hallel is an appropriate way of celebrating. That's like the same Chasam Sofer. Therefore, They want to compare it to that. So he says, Rav Meshulam Roth says, you say it. He compares it to that day as well. He says you should, like Purim, you should make a bracha. And Rav Chaim HaLevi, he also writes you should make a bracha how on Yom HaAtzmout, because he says it's Chalta de Geula. Having the state of Israel is the beginning of the ultimate step in the redemption, and therefore it's the beginning of the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore it's okay. Rav Avadia Yosef doesn't like this because based on the Yerushalmi, because he says it's Chalta de Geula, you can't say Hallel on, because the question is, why didn't the Jews say Hallel right when they left Mitzrayim? Why didn't they sing Shira? It says Oz Yoshia Moshe. They sang it after Kriyas Yamsuf. Why didn't they sing it right away? So the Yerushalmi writes, because you can't sing Shira until you're out of danger, until you're safe. Mm-hmm. So obviously the Jews were not safe. They're not safe now. I mean, with what's going on. So therefore, so he doesn't like. Again, he says to say Hallel, but he doesn't like the comparison to Schal Tegula, and he says you wouldn't make Hallel with a bracha. Rav Shachter also says the concept of Schal Tegula is significant in the establishment of Yom HaAtzmout, and therefore about being Kovei Yontif. So again, I'd say there's a minority view. Again, not taking the yeshivish Welt approach or Samer, but we're working within it. We're assuming Eretz Yisrael is a good thing, miraculous, etc. Mm-hmm. So you have a minority view who would say even with a bracha. The majority who take the approach would say Hallel without a bracha, because I'm saying it's based on this Chasam Sofer Netziv issue, because we don't have perhaps this Hallel is only D'Rabbanan and we have no right to make a bracha. And then within that, how far do you want to go? Do you say a full Hallel? Do you go with a Chatzi Hallel? There's a different minhagim. But just to conclude, the point is, and that's why Hallel is a technical, Hallel is a halachic issue. Mm-hmm. It's not, it's not a talk radio issue where, I think we should say Hallel. It's okay to have feelings, but it's a halachic issue. Mm-hmm. You could have all your feelings once it's halachic basis, and we could discuss as we just spent the whole year going through many technical details. It's not simple. You can't just say, I want to say Hallel because I feel like it. You could be a Makadev. But the point being is you have to. But whether Hallel is included in your day or not, depending on on speaking to your Rav and etc. and learning the sugya, the point is you have to realize at least that it's a special day. Hey Iyar, a day where we got Eretz Yisrael, all the miracles have continued to happen, all the Hakaras HaTov, whether it's personally and all the, and now unbelievably I had the chance to go visit people who imagine, who couldn't even imagine they spent their whole lives trying to get there. Eretz Yisrael, never even got there. I think there was I forgot who it was, one of the Gedolim came to Yerushalayim and he couldn't even get a minyan. But he had not. So today, thousands of people living, millions of people living, and in terms of all the yeshivas and Torah learning, so so many tremendous things, and the constant miracles that happen from 1948, 67, the Scuds. We don't even know half the miracles because God does so many of them behind the scenes. And that's also one of the issues they discuss about Hallel and Yom HaAtzmout, but Hallel in general. Do you need Hallel? Do you need a Nes Nigla or not? Do you need an open miracle or not in order to say Hallel? So some say, if you say you don't need a Nes Nigla, so there's nothing to talk about.
Like Hanukkah.
Right, so some say, Hanukkah, that's why Hanukkah you had one.
Purim you don't.
Yeah, Hanukkah you had because you had with the that's why Al-Eza Nes Kavua on the near Hanukkah. The question is, if you don't need one, so then it wouldn't be an issue. But if you do need one, the question, do you consider them Nes and Nig? In other words, it's not, even though we've won all these miraculous wars, but it wasn't like we took a machine gun, we shot and a monster came out and ate the enemy like some Disney movie. In fact, we have Yom HaZikaron first, because Yom HaAtzmout, because many soldiers and citizens have given up their life, Eretz Yisrael. In fact, I'll conclude on this note. That's why the Rebbe explained. That's why they instituted Yom HaZikaron before Yom HaAtzmout, because as it's always, as we explain the Maharal by Pesach, if the night of Pesach is all about freedom, so let's just get to the good stuff. Why are we talking about this slavery? Because to fully appreciate what freedom is, you have to know what slavery is. And therefore we had to go through it. So too, to fully appreciate what Eretz Yisrael is, we have to know what we gave up. For those who were born before the creation of the state and knew a world without it, they don't need any reminder, they know. But for many of us who are spoiled, we grew up with it and we take it for granted, like we take everything for granted. So that's why, we have to realize, it's good, we should recognize it every day of the year, but at least Hey Iyar on the day that we got Eretz Yisrael, so at least, whether it's going to be Hallel or not, you speak to your local Rav and you'll get your own psak. But in terms of having that Hakaras Hatov and appreciation, the fact that we have it, and all the soldiers and all the people protecting it, that itself warrants, whether we have a right to Kovei Yantiv today, all those questions, those are halachic issues. I'm not even getting into that. The issue is that no, it shouldn't just be a day that's a regular day like any other day without, it's a special day to realize and appreciate and have a Hakaras Hatov for all the Chastei Hashem, all the miracles that happen daily, the ones we know about and probably just as many as the ones we don't know about that happen every day. God's doing miracles, protecting us all over the world, but especially, in a nace surrounded by, millions of enemies, and the fact that we still have, the Jews living in Eretz Yisrael today.